Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Invest in Yourself, the podcast series. I am, of course, your podcast mogul, Phil Better. And today I am very happy to have with me the host of as he likes to call it, the B-list celebrity catch-all. He loves getting those B-list celebrities because that's his main niche. It's classic conversations with Jeff Dwoskin. Jeff, thank you so much for being here.
Uh, Great to be here. I never said be.
Maybe I say you get catch all because you get a lot of great celebrities that I don't see on any other podcast. So I feel like you get all of the really good B-list celebrities to your podcast.
I get celebrities that you may see at Comic Cons or on TV if you were viewing in the 70s.
B-list celebrities, that's it. That's the main niche. But Jeff, I know a lot about you because we're friends on Facebook. We follow each other. I love listening to your podcast. But my audience doesn't know you. So they may not know that you have a podcast. So how about you give us a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. I've always been of a creator mindset. I'm really into the web, and that's how I kind of built up my original following on Twitter and all that kind of stuff. I had one of the very first web development companies in the late 90s and continued to do a lot of cool digital marketing things. The podcast sort of grew from the pandemic and my inability to continue to do stand-up comedy as all the clubs closed during the pandemic. So stand-up comedian for 20 years as well. Mostly retired now. I'm a full-time podcaster, but a lot of that background helps me, I think, with my conversations with the people I have on my show and just being able to kind of navigate those waters. But yeah, in 2020, May 2020, I started podcast and started reaching out to folks that, I didn't know if they'd say yes or no, but, like celebrities, people I wanted to talk to. That's really what I wanted to do with my podcast. And people started saying yes, and then they kept saying yes. And then when they saw who else was on it, then that made it easier to do, get other guests. And so, I'm past the 250 mark. I'm past 250 episodes. And so, pretty proud of that. And yeah, I mean, it's cool. I've had people back on the show. I've had, they request to come back. I think that was Burt Ward was episode 50, and he was like, he's Robin from Batman 66. And so getting him on my show was cool because I think I was like one of the, at least in the circle, one of the first to get him on my show. And so that was a big deal for me because I thought that was a big. I was like,
You made it.
I have peaked. This is episode 50, and I am rocking. And he was just again on episode 250. But what I thought was cool about that was they called me that time. Hey, Bert wants to come back on the show. I'm like, okay, cool. I can do that. And so, it was like, oh, I'm coming up on 250. That's kind of nice. That sounds nice, right? Episode 50 and then 250. That sounds kind of cool. There's a ring to it in my ears, at least. So, we did that, and that was a lot of fun and covered new ground, which was hard because the first interview was long, but I wanted to make sure we were covering different Batman stuff. So yeah, so it was cool. It's a lot of fun. I really, really enjoy doing it. I think to get past pod fade, you really have to really enjoy what you're doing and the format that you chose and how you do it and all that kind of good stuff. It's a lot of work. And, so kudos to everyone who's, has a podcast and keeps on doing it or does anything from a creative point of view. So.
Yeah, like pod fade isn't unique to just podcasters. We just named it pod fade, but there's fade in all art forms. Yeah, like you said, like it just you have to keep going, getting it. You have to go through I'm the worst person in the whole world. I can't believe I can do that. I'm doing this, and people listen, and then you start getting a little, ego boost. Like you got Burt Ward at 50, like I can do this, and then at 250 you get that second ego boost because he requests to come on. Yeah, it's you have to love those little small wins when you get them because they keep you going for during those little valleys of self-doubt that we all have as creatives.
Exactly. Exactly.
I want to know what. So obviously, the pandemic and you not being able to do your stand up was the reason you started your podcast. But what was the? How did the idea about having conversations with celebrities come about? Like, what made you say, you know what, I'm going to try and get these celebrities instead of going the route that everybody else does and just get everyday folks on the podcast? Like, what was your like? How did you know that it was kind of going to work? Or did you have any idea that it was going to work?
You know, in all fairness, I bought all the equipment in 2017. I mentioned like I was going to do, I was in the Twitter and all that kind of stuff with my comedy. I had gone viral a lot. I'd been in a lot of publications with my tweets. And so I wanted to really focus something on social media. And because that was a huge part of me as well. And it was going to be called Viral Intentions, which was sort of a play on Cruel Intentions, but going viral. And so I basically, it sat on my desk. I had the soundboard, everything. I had an intro, outro, art, everything. It just never did it, and ended up in a box, and then somewhere I didn't even know where that box ended up. And when the pandemic hit, March 2020, I pull everything out of the box. And I'm like, oh, finally, we're all home now. I got time. And then I put everything together and I'm like, it's March 2020. I cannot start a podcast called Viral Intentions, right? With people dying and the
Yeah,
pandemic in full swing. Okay. So I was like, crap. So the current version, which started off as the Jeff Dwoskin show, and then live from Detroit, the Jeff Dwoskin show, and eventually a while ago now, became Classic Conversations once I kind of really understood what I was doing. And, it was somebody introduced me to a couple people, and it was just, I was like, oh, okay. Originally, I was going to do like a 12-minute podcast, and then I think it was Larry Hankin that I was talking to, and he's like, 12 minutes? No. And, and that was like an hour and a half, and so I was like, all right, this is good. If people will talk to me, you know what I mean? And I remember Bruce Valanche was one of the early ones, and then I reached out to someone else who was an author, Judy Carter, and I was like, hey, I'd love to talk to you. I'm like, I loved your book. It was important to me when I was doing stand up. I'm reaching out to people that, that made a difference in my life, and those are the people I want to talk to, and you're one of them. So, and she said, well, if it's good enough for Bruce Valanche, it's good enough for you. And so I was like, oh, okay, I get this now. This is cool. So, it was just a matter of, it's funny. I went to some podcast conventions or virtual ones at the time, and watched some other people that were doing celebrities, and they're like, hey, this is how we reach out to celebrities. And I'm like, okay. And so I started reaching out to celebrities, and the funny thing is, like, later the person that I remember watching, telling me, that taught me, is DMing me, asking me questions. I'm like, I didn't say this, it was in my head. I'm like, I learned from you.
and you're coming to me. Oh my God, am I now the teacher?
So, but it was cool. I think if I were to give any advice to podcasters, it was like when I first started, my logical thought was that, why would I want to group with podcasters? I need people to listen to my show. Why I'm not going to hang out with people and then feel I have to tell them to listen to their show too. It's going to take away from my show. And I realized that was the complete wrong mentality. Is that the biggest supporters of podcasters are other podcasters, and your biggest fans are other people who are doing podcasts, even the ones that are similar to mine. And by similar, I mean maybe they talk to celebrities as well. But we all have different interests, and sometimes they'll share guests with me, I'll share guests with them, that kind of thing. So it's all fine, it's all great, because especially when you realize that your friends and family just have literally no interest in your podcast, like none.
It's so true. They say they support it, like, yeah, they'll like their posts on your Facebook, and then you ask them about the episode, you're like, oh, I'm so behind, and you're like, okay, yeah.
There's a few people, there's always very cool exceptions. There's definitely some people that do listen, but it's like, but most don't. And then it's like I realize that's where I started to learn, like, people would say, who's the most famous person you interviewed? And I would eventually, I realized the answer is, well, it depends on you. I can't answer that. That answer is, you'd have to look and tell me who you think the most famous
Famous
person I
person.
interviewed is, because who I think isn't necessarily who you're going to think. You may not even know the person that I think is the most famous person I talk to. And, like recently, Vernon Reed from Living Color, like that. Like, it's interesting. Like, you post something and like different people come out of the woodwork depending on their connection to a particular person. And then I realized, like, with my particular podcast with celebrities, is while I believe that you can listen to any episode of mine and you'll enjoy it and hear stories, and they're cool and relatable about how they overcame whatever they overcame, or the one moment that we all kind of share in our lives one way or another. They just became actors, right? That just was their path. And so I try and make them interesting. I like to think that they're interesting. You'll learn, and maybe you'll then go listen to something that they did or watch something that they did. But the reality is, it's like they'll go, oh, In Living Color, Cult of Personality, my favorite band from the 80s or whatever. And then they'll kind of glom onto that one. And then maybe they'll go and they'll go, oh, I love the Brady Bunch, I'll listen to this one, that kind of thing. So, which is fine. That came with time. In the beginning, you only have the episodes you have. But once you have 250, people can go in and cherry pick. And so I'm like, okay. Because, like, in my head, honestly, when I started, like, I assumed people were going to listen linearly. So I had running jokes in
Throughout.
it. Like, if you listen to it, like, where if you kind of followed along, there would be certain things that I always did, or certain things that I always did the same but differently. And, like, if you were listening to just one, you wouldn't realize that. But if you were listening to them all the way straight through, you realize, oh wait, why is he he calls the announcer a different name every episode? You know what I mean? And it was like, so to me, that was like a little Easter egg. Like, the name that I call had something to do with my guests that would only really mean anything to me, but that's why I did it. And so little things. And then I realized, oh, nobody does that, and nor do I want people to go back to those early episodes.
Yeah, the earlier the episodes, the worse I feel. Like we're both in the same category. We've done over 200 episodes. We're these like old hats to us. But when we look back at our earlier episodes, like the first 100 episodes, I cringe at those. Do you feel the same way? Like your first 100 episodes or your first set of episodes, it's cringeworthy, quote unquote.
Yeah, I always make the joke, if you listen to my podcast backwards, I get worse. And so, like early on, there's something like in comedy where people go on stage and they can bomb and they think they did great, because we call it laugh ears, because they think they heard what they heard what they wanted to hear. And when I went back, and I don't listen to my own shows again. I mean, I listen to them when I edit it, I put it together, I make sure
Yeah.
everything's right. But once it's live, I'm done. And like, if my wife's listening in the other room, I'm like, please put on headphones. I don't want to hear it. You know what I mean? It's like,
because then you're going to be critical of yourself, and you'll be like, oh, why did I say this, or why did I? Yeah, no,
exactly. And like, I edit different now than maybe I did back then. And so I remember when I switched platforms once, so I had to go back and put in like ad markers. So I was listening to that first episode, and all of a sudden I'm talking, and all of a sudden, and then I'm talking, and I can't stand those deep breath sounds. It's like, they drive me nuts, especially like when people listen at 1.5, 2 speed, and then that just sounds even worse, and so it drives me nuts. And so I went back and edited some of those early episodes. And I realized at some point, enough was enough. But it's little things like that little kind of editing ticks that I didn't pick up on or do till later, or tricks that I learned later to help do stuff. So, early ones, I didn't even have multi-track. I didn't know what that was yet. And so, once I learned that, then, it's a game changer. And, you know what I mean? Like, you on one track, someone else on another. And so, once I did that, then, the more you learn, the more you kind of change the approach to how you're doing it. And, And so when you go back, it was fine at the time. At the moment, it was fine. But I remember like listening to the first episode, and the way I thought I sounded in my head was not the way I sound now. Like now, I honestly believe I sound as comfortable as I'm doing it. But back then, in my head, I did. But hey, welcome to the Jeff Dwoskin show. But in my head, I was like, welcome to the Jeff Dwoskin show. How are ya? But it was like, that's not how it was.
You're very meek. In your head, you
Yeah.
look like a lion, but in reality, you're just this little
I
mouse.
thought I was pushing it, but I wasn't. And then people would be like, I yelled at some of those early folks. I'm like, what are you doing? You said it was awesome. You said it was great. And I was like, it was at the time. It was perfect. And I'm like, wow, this is just, I can't even listen to this.
This is the worst shit that's ever been out. Why did someone put this out there? And like one of the things I do when I talk with podcasters who are first starting out, I'm like, your first episode is going to be your best episode, but also your worst episode. Because it's your first episode, so you feel so proud of it. It's going to be like, yay. But when you go back and listen to it, you're going to be like, this is the worst piece of shit that I've ever created. But it's also the best because it's what sparked where you are today. Like I can say that my interviewing skills have skyrocketed. If I look back at the first episode I ever did to today, it's much more fluid. And I thought I was a good interviewer beforehand. And you, after interviewing 258 celebrities, I want to know, what is your secret when you're interviewing someone, either in the prep, during the interview, the post-interview, anywhere you want to put in a tip for our podcasters who do interviews?
The biggest macro tip I can say is just let your guests talk. There's a tendency to want to make it seem like you're having this weird conversation. Like you go, oh, really? Well, tell me more about that. Like where you're constantly interrupting just because you feel like you need to get your voice out there. And I feel like you ask the question, let them just answer it. You know what I mean? Jot down if you have a response. You know what I mean? You can go back. You don't have to do it real time. You can ask them about something they said a minute ago when they're done telling you the story. By interrupting them, you know how like when you're at a party and you're having like the greatest conversation ever, it's just like the great, and you're like, and then somebody goes, oh, let's go sit on the couch. And you go sit on the couch and the conversation's over. You know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And it was like, because you changed the whole vibe. You just broke that flow. That's what you do when you interrupt people, when you talk. They may have been about to tell you the greatest story, but if you interrupt them to go, yeah, what was she like? Like, and he was just about to tell this other story. You cut it off and it's not coming back, because possibly they'll probably just forget, because you get them into a nice flow. And honestly, the more people feel like you're listening to them, the more they'll talk. And so you got to just let them go. Now, I will admit that this skill came from the fact that, from technology wise, I had to not interrupt them, because it would blow out their speaker when they were talking. When two people, it would duck, right? And so, because a lot of times the people I talk to don't have microphones and they don't have headphones. So I have to be careful. And a lot of times I'll tell them up front, if I don't immediately laugh at something you say, if I do it internally, it's because I don't want to blow out the sound and then I can't use it, right? I can always fix it later. And so that, though, made me not talk. And then and I realized, oh, by not talking, they tell me more, right? And so that was sort of like the one thing. And then, you got to push it, and then, you just kind of prod it, and then you kind of you ask follow-up questions. You can take it where you want it to go, that kind of thing. But it's not about not talking. It's just don't interrupt them. Let them get everything out that they need to get out.
I fully agree. And I my main thing is, like, when I go on when I'm a host, the guest is the main person. Their voice should be at least 75% of the recording should be their voice. So I love that you said that. Just shut up. Ask the question, shut up, nod along instead of saying, yeah, mm-hmm. and that's going to help a lot more because it's going to be encouraging. Like when someone nods, people agree and like, okay, they're liking what I'm saying. I can see this visual cue instead of the audio cue that we normally have. I think that's a great tip. And I also would like to add silence, like just silence after an answer, maybe like 5 seconds, usually gets them to just spill a bit more and go on for another stream of thoughts, so that you can be like, I don't have to do more of my work.
Right. You get them talking. One of the things I do if I'm interviewing somebody is I listen to them do interviews. I listen to, like, if I'm interviewing Burt Ward, I'd already interviewed him, but the first time I'd go listen to him on someone else's podcast, because I like to know if they're a talker, if they're a short answer person. Those kind of realities are important going in. Because if you're expecting them to tell you all these stories and they go, yep, being on Batman was great. And that's it. Like, you got to like be ready to either, draw more out, and be prepared, or just know that ahead of time so you can have quick follow-up questions to kind of get them to open up more. So, yeah.
I'm curious on that regard of getting them to talk more. Like, yes, listening to previous interviews that they do, obviously, to make sure you don't ask the same question, or you can get a nice follow-up question to it. That's always something's good, helping throw back to another interview they did and help other podcasters. Do you usually have a few minutes in the green room beforehand to start the conversation so that there's somewhat of a familiarity with the guest, or do you just jump straight into the interview?
It really depends. Some people, we chat a little bit, and I realized I had to be careful because they might think the interview started.
Ah,
You don't want them to answer questions before you're recording, because they won't answer it the same. They'll answer it less the second time, because they had just said it. There's just a natural tendency to do that. So you don't want to use up that organic response, I mean, I will chatter, if oh, I love you. And then, talk about something that isn't necessarily that. I'll say, when I start, I'll do an intro and then we'll get going. I'm not recording yet. Is there anything you don't want me to ask?
okay.
Anything you don't want to talk about? I've only had ever one person really specifically say, don't talk about this. But I ask that just out of courtesy. I'd say, hey, if you cough, just take a pause. I can delete it. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. Or,
Just give them the overview.
If you want to, I could do that. So it depends. I mean, I've had people that were done and they go, thanks, bye. And then I've had people I talk to, I turn off the camera or turn off the recorder and we talk for 20 more minutes. We just talk, you know what I mean? So it's all different. It just depends on who they are, what they got going on and all that kind of stuff. But, you just, obviously the more you kind of connect with them a little bit, even up front, as long as they know they're in a safe space. That's really, I think, what anybody wants to know. They're just in a safe space, and then they'll talk from there. So.
I love that. I love that. Also, another piece of great advice: give them that safe space. Let them know that, hey, this is for you to support you, and I want to make sure that you're the star here, not about me. Out of all the guests that you've had, and I know you've mentioned Burt Ward a few times, being you were surprised that like Burt was on your podcast because he was you were one of his first podcast appearances, and then he came back and the request.
Well, he's been on a lot. I just mean like he wasn't like I didn't see him actively making the rounds when I had him on
that's what I mean. Like nowadays he's a old hat at this game.
Right.
I'm wondering who is one of the celebrities that you've gotten on your podcast that you were like, wow, like it was like a kind of like not a dream guess, but one that you were like, oh, this was kind of like a Hail Mary. Like I wasn't sure that this person was going to say yes.
They're all Hail Marys. I mean, so many no's, but I loved like being able to talk to Sharon Glass, Cagney and Lacey, Ed Asner. That was a Hail Mary, I think. I had been connected on Twitter, but I really love talking to Kato Kalin from the O.J. Simpson trial. Robert Klein, comedian Robert Klein, that was interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's everyone's like, you reach out to like a bunch of people. If I reach out to 10 and one of them kind of says yes, then I'm like, whew, you know what I mean? So it's like awesome. Will Wheaton, took forever. Then he wrote a book, and he was on my podcast. He was on a lot of podcasts at that point, but that was cool. And then, I mean, I have some guests that I wish I'd known more when I had them on. Like I had John Glazer on. He was Councilman Jeremy Jam on Parks and Rec, but I had never seen Parks and Rec.
Ooh.
And so I didn't really get to dive into that part of his career with him. And then after we watched all of Parks and Rec, I'm like, oh God, that was, but I didn't, but then I did reach out to Jim O'Hare, who played Jerry, Gary, Terry, and he came on the show. So I was able to kind of deep dive and go geeky on Parks and Rec with him. And so that was cool. Like I love the Orville. I reached out to a bunch of them, and I got 3 of them on my show. That's probably the most recent. In terms of a show I had people on. I was able to get 3 people from that show. Timmy from Lassie. What? Timmy's in the well? That guy was on
who's always in the well.
Right. Which funny thing you learn is that actually Timmy was never in a well on Lassie. He never was actually in a well. That's just a phrase. Nicholas Hammond, who played Spider-Man in the 70s, when they were doing the new Spider-Man No Way Home, where they were all in it. And so Hollywood Reporter interviewed him. And then I said, about, do you think, ever, now that there's multiverse, that they'll bring you in? And I noticed that every publication that was running the same article was just rerunning the Hollywood Reporter article, and as a source. And so I'm like, So I reached out to him direct, and I'm like, and then they're like, yeah, he'll come on your show. I'm like, awesome, because he was in the Sound of Music too. He was one of the Von Trump kids, and so that was cool. And everyone's like. Everyone I talk to is like at least one, if not more than one, really cool pop culture thing that I glob onto that I really love. I've been introduced to a lot of people. People like to then introduce me to people I may not have had on the show. But then I get to discover those people, and so that's cool as well. Just being able to this guy was a showrunner for Night Court. The original Night Court. Oh, that's cool. And SCTV and Cheers. Yeah, sure, why not? Okay, sounds good to me.
Yeah, no, I don't want to meet this person at all.
Well, it's just there's so many people that you don't necessarily like. I had Al Jean on my show, and he's the executive producer of The Simpsons for like 30 years now, and he grew up in the same town that I grew up in, Farmington Hills, Michigan, and so they had. In that area was Gene's Hardware. So his family owned a small hardware store. And that's where we would go on the weekends. That's where my dad bought all his stuff, is at Gene's Hardware. So when I would watch The Simpsons, I'd always go, Al Gene, Gene's Hardware. You know what I mean? So when I reached out to him, I'm like, hey, I'm from we grew up in the same city. And I would spend weekends going, to Gene's Hardware. Now, when I say I reached out to like, his manager or publicist or something. But I got an email back from him. And he's like, I'm happy to talk to any past customer of Gene's Hardware.
That's amazing.
I know. And I tell you, he had to reschedule a couple of times, and like he did it. He goes, I gotta, and like he would follow up with me. Hey, how's this? And I'm thinking to myself, this guy's running the biggest show ever, and for 30 years, and he doesn't, and like he's doing, and like what a cool guy, It's not always. Usually you deal with the publicist, and I never even have the contact information of the people I talk to. We meet on the
Zoom call,
the software, and then that's it, And so, so it's always fun when they go, hey, my manager sent me your info, love to be on your show, So that's cool. So that's fun. So,
who is maybe in your dream 100, a guest that you want to have on your podcast, and you'll not say that you've made it, but you'll be like, if I retire after this guest, I'll be happy.
Um, a reality with Henry Winkler would be my one. I mean, I've been rejected 4 times, but
Hey,
but I keep trying.
it's always no if you don't ask, right? So if you
Right.
keep asking,
Um, he would be the coolest person. I've met him twice, like at an event and at a Comic Con. Nicest guy in the world. But I would love to interview him. And then uh, Steven Spielberg would be cool, obviously, and then or obviously for me.
I think just interviewing
Yeah,
Steven
yeah,
Spielberg, period, would be an honor for most podcasters.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people I've enjoyed pretty much everyone that I've met. And, some people we connect and then we stay on social media, and then some it's like um, John Billings, he's a bass player for the Monkees. One of my other guests introduced me, we clicked and we just had a really good time. Ted Neely, who was Jesus and Jesus Christ Superstar. Haven't talked to him since the interview, but during the interview was when we clicked. You talk about like clicking, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and like we had a really good time. And I've had people like comment to me that listen to that episode and they go, I loved how you made Ted laugh. He never laughed. You know what I mean? I was like, okay, cool. But yeah, I mean, I think people appreciate who come on my show how much research I put into, getting to understand them and their careers. And, it's not uncommon. You'll hear that at the end of the interview where they'll say something. And sometimes they say it after I turn the thing off. But yeah, but that's always a big win for me to be acknowledged like that. Because I think they show up. You can listen to a lot of, I mentioned I listen to other podcasts. And so, sometimes you can tell that like the person just wasn't prepared or like wasn't, didn't really know who they were talking to and on any level. You know what I mean? You can't know someone's full thing. Some people
History.
have done 100 things, but you should be able to focus in on a few of them. You know what I mean? So I don't know. That's the other trick. I mean, we talked about listening earlier, but the other trick is if they know that you know who they are, they'll open up as well. I mean, that goes for anyone, not just a celebrity. If someone says, "Oh, I'm a fan. I listened to your thing. I read your thing," if you make someone feel that good, they're going to share more immediately. So, taking the time to get to know your guests. I put a lot of time into the prep for my guests, a lot.
On average, how many hours or days do you put into prep for your for an episode?
If they wrote a book, I'll read the book. So however long that takes, but I'll generally try and push those off at least a month. So I have time just to kind of work it in. I've made the mistake of having to read multiple books at the same time. But I read the book, I take notes. I'll, depending on who it is, I'll definitely rewatch things that they were in, especially if, like I interviewed Gail Ann Hurd, and she was the executive producer with James. She was married to James Cameron at one point. They did Terminator together, Terminator 2. She was executive producer of The Walking Dead and that whole every franchise there, and Aliens and all the early Cameron stuff. And so far I rewatched Aliens. I rewatched Terminator 1 and 2. Because you want your memory of things is different than if you just watched it, and you can you forget certain themes or things that happened, or you can specifically talk about something that maybe they won't remember, but a lot of times they do. So that's so it depends. That's prep, but I also enjoy watching those movies. So it's like it's not the worst homework in the world. If they were on certain shows, I'll dig up that scene and I'll watch that scene. If they were on Curb, I'll watch it. Something like that. So you can talk specifically about it beyond just like, oh, you were on the Brady Bunch.
Yeah. Going in like, okay, you were on this episode. This was the theme. What was it like on this? You can go into a more detailed analysis and get really like things that most not surface level. You're going to iceberg level at that regard when you start dropping into those type of research roles.
Yeah, well, it's again, it's things that I am interested in and I love. So it's like you watch and you pick up on certain things, and then you can talk about those things, and then maybe that reminds them of something else from another show or something that they did, or oh, I also worked with that person on this and we did that. So the key is just to kind of start you know
Digging.
digging in, like connecting some dots. Oh, you did this with this person, you also did this with them, that kind of thing, or little things like that. So.
I love it. Jeff, we are coming up to the end of the episode, which I hate because I hate ending episodes, especially with great podcasters who have like probably like a billion stories about different celebrities or different guests that they've had on that just share amazing stories. Because I'm pretty sure you're the life of the party. Like obviously you're a comedian, you already know how to story tell, but then you can just talk about the stories that you heard from celebrities at parties. You're probably the life of the party, even more when you go out.
No one wants to hear my stuff.
Yeah, no, Jeff, tell me about the time you interviewed Burt Ward. Well, I have to ask because I'm a huge Bill and Ted, and this is strictly for me. I'm a huge Bill and Ted fan. You recently had Alex Winter on your podcast. What was it like interviewing one of the Wild Stallions?
Really cool, and that was. It's interesting. If you listen to my podcast, I generally don't do press junkets.
Mm-hmm.
Well, two reasons. One, I enjoy longer interviews, and two, which might be the more important one, is I've never really been invited to one.
I'm pretty sure you're not going to say no if you're invited to one.
Well, it's just I'm not into 3-minute interviews. Like like I'm not going to read a book to talk to someone. I'm not going to watch 5 hours of a TV show to talk to someone for 3 minutes. You know what I mean? I'm not that interested in throwing a name out to you to do that. You know what I'm saying? Like to me, it's part of what I get out of it is that time together.
Yeah.
So, but with Alex Winter, the opportunity came up, and so I got to spend 20 minutes with him. And I wasn't going to pass that up. You know what I mean? So, plus I really loved the movie, so I get to watch the movie. They sent me a screener so I can watch it. And it was really cool and important. So it was like, sometimes those things are, that kind of trumps the other stuff, in terms of that. I also like longer interviews because I need
time to warm up.
Well, I need to fill in I need to, put spots for my ads.
We'll get money here, folks. He needs the ad time. Like he has to have a 30-minute episode minimum.
Kind of, but but I mean, he was super cool, and he was one of those where when I posted it, it was like it got a lot of reaction, and as well it should have, because he's super cool. He's a great director too. That's the interesting thing about when you talk to a lot of these folks. Is we all know them as one thing, Bill Esquire, but at Bill S. Preston Esquire, but he is like an amazing documentary director, and so he's done a lot of cool stuff, and a lot of these people have done a lot of cool stuff since being the pop culture icons that we know them to be. So it's good. It's cool learning about those things and sharing those things as well.
I love that. All right, Jeff, I'm going to jump off the stage here. I'm going to let you have the screen for a bit. I want you to tell everybody where they can find Classic Conversations and all your stuff for your stand-up and everything else you do and the crazy stuff that you have in the world, sir. So the floor is yours.
Oh, hey, what's up? Hey, you can go to Classic-Conversations, or you can go to jeffisfunny.com. It'll redirect. They all go to the same place. That's sort of my website, but you can find Classic Conversations on Apple, Spotify, anywhere really. I'm where all your podcasts are. Wherever you're listening to this, I'm sure you can find Classic Conversations as well. So tons of great episodes to choose from, and hopefully you'll listen to all of them. You can, if you do it on 2-speed, you can be done in like 6 days. If you hardcore go through it in 6 days at 2-speed, you can get right through it. So that's my challenge to you. And I don't know how long he's keeping me or by myself.
I was just waiting for you to finish. I was kind of like seeing the secret there, the silent secret. No, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show, talking with us about some of the crazy guests, the amazing guests that you've had on, and the experiences you've been able to do from your podcast. I love it, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. See, I just love seeing when you pop up. Hey, did you know I have a podcast? I love that promotion that you do for your podcast. So thank you so much, sir, for being on the show.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Everybody, to my audience, make sure you check out the show notes down below, because that's where you can find all the links to Jeff's podcast, his social media, everything there. I want to thank you very much for listening. Jeff, again, thank you for coming on the show. And remember always to invest in yourself.